The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from inside the marriage. It came from a stranger. He noticed her in a cafe he passed every morning without thinking. A narrow place wedged between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner, the kind of spot people entered with purpose and left without memory. But that morning, he paused. She sat alone by the window, hands wrapped around a mug that had already gone cold. Her posture was composed, back straight, coat neatly folded on the chair beside her. Nothing about her looked broken or dramatic. If anything, she looked like someone who had everything under control. What caught his attention was her silence. Not the obvious kind, not the kind filled with sadness or tears. It was quieter than that. He noticed it in the way she watched people pass outside without really seeing them, in the way her phone lay face down on the table, untouched, in the way she seemed to be waiting for something she had already decided not to ask for. He didn't know her. He didn't know her story. Yet something about her stillness felt familiar, unsettling in a way he couldn't name. Later, he would realize why. At the time, he told himself he was imagining things. Everyone carries something, he thought. Everyone has mornings like that. He went home, rinsed his mug, and started his day. That same morning, she stood in her kitchen, holding her phone in one hand while the other rested on the counter. The message was simple: running late. Don't wait up. She reread it slowly, not because it needed decoding, but because she was deciding whether to respond at all. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She considered writing, "I'll save you a plate." She considered asking how late was late. She considered adding a heart, or a question, or anything that suggested presence. Instead, she told herself none of that was necessary. They'd had this rhythm for years. Late nights, short messages, understanding without explanation. She didn't want to seem needy. She didn't want to interrupt. She didn't want to create a conversation that might require more energy than either of them had left. So she placed the phone face down. It was a decision so small it barely registered as one. Warm water filled the sink. A single mug waited to be washed. The house was quiet in the way it always was on weekday mornings. Orderly, efficient, emotionally neutral. That quiet had once felt like peace. They married later than most of their friends, after careers were established and habits already formed. Neither of them believed in chaos. Neither of them believed love had to be loud to be real. He grew up in a home where problems were solved quietly. If something broke, his father fixed it. If someone was disappointed, his mother adjusted her expectations. No one raised their voice. No one asked for more than what was offered. Affection existed, but it was practical. Roofs were repaired. Meals were cooked. Bills were paid on time. Emotions, when inconvenient, were folded away and handled privately. He learned early that steadiness mattered more than expression. She learned her lessons differently. In an earlier relationship, she had been open, curious, verbal. She had asked questions about the future. She had spoken about feelings before they hardened into resentments. She believed that honesty was a form of care. That belief cost her. She was told she thought too much, felt too deeply, needed reassurance too often. What she had called communication, someone else had called pressure. So she adjusted. She became easier to love by becoming harder to hear. When they found each other, the fit felt natural. Neither demanded more than the other knew how to give. They respected space. They handled responsibilities like partners who trusted each other's competence. They didn't fight. Friends noticed that first. They hosted dinners that ended on time. Conversations stayed polite. There were no awkward moments, no emotional spills. People left their home impressed by how calm everything felt. Solid, someone once said. Mature, said another. You two are lucky. More than one person told them. They believed it. They believed that love meant not making life harder for the person you chose. Silence, in that context, felt considerate. If something bothered him, he worked through it alone. If something hurt her, she asked herself whether it truly needed to be said. Most of the time, she decided it didn't. At first, that restraint felt like harmony. The trouble with habits is that they grow quietly. The first time she mentioned visiting family for a weekend, it sounded casual, not urgent, just an idea offered gently, as if she were testing whether it fit into their shared life. He hesitated, not because he didn't want her to go, but because his mind immediately moved to logistics, expenses, timing, commitments they already had. We'll see, he said. He meant it literally. He needed time to think. She heard something else. She heard hesitation as reluctance. She heard practicality as dismissal. She told herself it wasn't important. She told herself she could visit another time. When weeks passed and the trip never came up again, neither of them mentioned it. Later, when she spoke about missing home, his response was immediate and sincere. You should have gone. She smiled. It's fine, she said. That phrase slipped easily from her mouth. It required no explanation, no response, no emotional follow-up. It became useful. Their marriage continued to function beautifully. Calendars aligned. Groceries were restocked without discussion. When his parent fell ill, she rearranged her work schedule without complaint. When her job became uncertain, he took on extra hours without mentioning the strain. They loved each other through action, but something subtle began to shift. Conversations shortened. Questions became statements. Check-ins turned into updates. They spoke about what needed to be done, not about how they felt doing it. She started staying later at work, not because she had to, but because returning home to quiet felt heavier than remaining busy. He noticed, but explained it away as ambition, stress, responsibility. Stress had solutions. Emotions felt abstract. Neither of them realized they were making the same choice over and over again, choosing comfort over curiosity, peace over presence, silence over risk. That stranger in the cafe would later come back to him in memory, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. A life that looked composed from the outside. A person who had learned how to endure quietly. Someone who had mistaken silence for strength. At the time, he didn't know he was already living that lesson. And neither did she. The most dangerous decisions are not the loud ones. They are the small, reasonable choices made in the name of harmony. Choices that ask nothing in the moment, but take everything over time. By the time silence begins to feel normal, it is already doing its work. Silence rarely announces itself. It settles in the way dust does, slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize it's everywhere. At first, it felt harmless, even respectful. They told themselves they were being considerate, thoughtful, mature enough not to turn every feeling into a discussion. When days passed without anything difficult being said, it felt like success. He believed that harmony meant things were working. If there was no conflict, there was no problem. That belief had kept his childhood home steady, and he carried it forward without question. She believed strength meant self-management. If she could handle disappointment alone, then no one had to feel burdened by it. That belief had protected her once, and she trusted it more than she trusted her own needs. Neither of them asked where those beliefs would eventually lead. Their days fell into predictable patterns. Mornings were efficient. Evenings were calm. They shared space easily, like people who had learned how not to get in each other's way. Sometimes they talked about work, sometimes about errands, sometimes about nothing at all. They rarely talked about themselves. If she felt lonely, she told herself it was temporary. If he felt distant, he blamed fatigue. Both assumed the other would speak if something truly mattered. That assumption carried weight. One evening, she stood in the doorway, watching him scroll through his phone, his expression neutral, absorbed. She thought about sitting beside him, thought about asking how he was really doing, thought about telling him that she missed the version of them that used to talk longer than necessary. The moment passed. He looked up briefly, smiled, and returned to the screen. She told herself she was interrupting nothing important. Later, lying awake beside him, she listened to his breathing settle into sleep. She stared at the ceiling and wondered when she had started feeling like a guest in her own life. She didn't say anything, not because she didn't trust him, but because she didn't trust what would happen if she spoke. He, on the other hand, believed silence was proof of trust. If she wasn't complaining, she must be fine. If she needed something, surely she would say so. He didn't consider that her quiet might be intentional. He didn't consider that her quiet might be learned. They had both confused absence of conflict with presence of connection. The truth is, silence rewards itself at first. It keeps the peace. It prevents misunderstandings. It avoids uncomfortable conversations that might lead nowhere. But silence also teaches people how little they can say and still be loved. Over time, she learned which thoughts stayed safely inside. She learned which disappointments were easier to swallow than explain. She learned how to smooth her face, soften her voice, and make herself agreeable in ways that cost her more than she realized. Over time, he learned not to ask questions that might complicate things. He learned that if something truly mattered, it would surface on its own. He learned that emotional distance could be mistaken for independence. Neither noticed the quiet negotiations happening beneath the surface. The marriage did not suffer from neglect. It suffered from efficiency. They solved problems before they became conversations. They adjusted before resentment could form. They adapted until adaptation became identity. When friends asked how they were doing, the answer came easily. Good, busy, same as always. No one pressed further. Why would they? Everything looked fine. But fine is a dangerous place to live. Fine leaves no room for curiosity. Fine discourages deeper questions. Fine convinces people that longing is indulgent and needs are negotiable. The first time she realized something was truly wrong wasn't during an argument, because there were none. It was during a moment that should have felt intimate. They were sitting together, side by side, watching something neither of them cared about. His arm rested near hers, not touching. She felt the familiar urge to lean closer, to bridge the space. She didn't, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure he noticed the space at all. That thought scared her more than rejection would have. He noticed her hesitation, but misunderstood it. He assumed she wanted quiet. He assumed she was tired. He assumed wrong without knowing he was assuming anything. That is how silence deepens, not through cruelty, but through confidence in untested assumptions. The stranger in the cafe returned to her mind days later, though she didn't know why. The image stayed with her, a woman sitting still, composed, waiting for nothing she intended to request. She wondered how many people passed that woman without seeing her. She wondered how many people passed her. Education doesn't always come from instruction. Sometimes it comes from observation of others, of patterns, of yourself. She began noticing how often she edited her own thoughts before speaking. How often she decided something wasn't worth it. How often she prioritized calm over connection. He began noticing something too, though he couldn't name it yet. A quiet emptiness that didn't feel like sadness, but like absence. Like something expected that never arrived. He missed something, but didn't know what. They were still kind to each other, still reliable, still respectful, There was no villain in their story. That made it harder to see the damage. Because when no one is clearly wrong, it's easy to believe nothing is wrong at all. But relationships don't erode because of hatred. They erode because of neglect disguised as patience, avoidance disguised as peace, and silence disguised as strength. Neither of them woke up intending to withdraw. Neither of them planned to disappear from the other's emotional life. They simply kept choosing the easier option, not speaking, not asking, not risking discomfort. Those choices felt harmless on their own. Together, they were shaping something neither of them would recognize until it was nearly gone. By the time silence feels safe, it has already become powerful. And power, when left unquestioned, always demands a cost. If this story feels familiar, pause for a moment. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later it cost you something important? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. Silence does not begin in marriage. It is practiced long before love ever arrives. He learned it in a house where voices stayed low and problems stayed contained. Doors were fixed before anyone noticed they were broken. Bills were paid without discussion. If disappointment existed, it was handled privately, behind closed expressions and steady routines. No one ever said, "This how we cope." They didn't have to. The lesson was everywhere. When his father came home tired, he sat quietly. When his mother felt overwhelmed, she adjusted the schedule. Needs were managed, not named. Emotions were acknowledged only when they were practical. There were no explosions in that house, no dramatic confrontations. People prided themselves on being reasonable. Reasonable meant calm. Calm meant controlled. Controlled meant safe. He grew up believing that love was demonstrated through reliability. You showed up. You handled things. You didn't complicate life with unnecessary conversations. As a child, he learned to read the room instead of asking questions. He learned when to stay out of the way. He learned that peace depended on cooperation, and cooperation often required silence. No one told him his feelings didn't matter. They simply didn't ask about them. Over time, he stopped asking himself. When something upset him, he worked through it internally. When something felt unresolved, he trusted it would pass. He became good at patience, good at endurance, good at minimizing emotional friction. Those traits served him well. Teachers liked him. Employers trusted him. Friends described him as steady, dependable, easy to be around. No one ever accused him of being difficult. By the time he reached adulthood, silence felt like competence. Speaking only when necessary felt mature. So when he entered marriage, he brought those skills with him. He believed he was offering stability. He believed He was protecting the relationship from unnecessary strain. What he didn't see was the cost of that protection. She, on the other hand, learned silence through consequence. In her earlier relationship, she had believed communication was care. She spoke openly about fears before they hardened into resentment. She asked questions about where things were going. She shared what made her feel close and what made her feel distant. At first, her honesty was praised. She was told it was refreshing, different. Then it became inconvenient. Her partner began to sigh when she spoke, to glance away, to label conversations as too much. What she saw as connection, he saw as pressure. What she meant as honesty, he interpreted as dissatisfaction. The message came slowly, but clearly. Her feelings made things heavier. So she adapted. She learned to pause before speaking, learned to filter thoughts before they reached her mouth, learned which emotions were acceptable and which ones were better handled alone. Each adjustment felt reasonable. Each compromise felt small. She didn't stop feeling. She just stopped sharing. Over time, she confused self-control with self-erasure. She believed that love required restraint, that being easy to be with meant asking for less. By the time she met him, silence felt like safety. Together, they fit neatly into each other's lessons. Neither pushed, neither demanded, neither asked questions that might unsettle the calm they both valued. Their early conversations were thoughtful, but contained. Their affection was gentle, but measured. They admired this about each other. It felt like maturity. It felt like respect. When conflicts arose, and they did, quietly, both responded the same way, by softening, adjusting, letting things go. They trusted that love meant not turning every feeling into an issue. They didn't argue about money. They didn't fight about schedules. They didn't raise their voices. What they didn't realize was that conflict avoided is not conflict resolved. Every time one of them swallowed a thought, something was being taught. Every time a feeling went unspoken, a boundary shifted. Every time silence was rewarded with peace, it became easier to choose again. Education doesn't always look like instruction. Sometimes it looks like repetition. He learned that being dependable mattered more than being expressive. She learned that being agreeable mattered more than being honest. Neither belief was cruel. Neither belief was wrong on its own. But together, they created a relationship where emotional presence slowly became optional. When she felt something difficult rise, loneliness, doubt, longing, she evaluated it carefully. Is necessary this fair? Is this worth disturbing the calm? Most of the time, she decided it wasn't. When he sensed distance, he reasoned through it logically. Stress, work, timing, thing that would settle with patience. He trusted that if something truly mattered, it would be said. That trust was misplaced, but understandable. Silence had taught them both the same lesson from different angles. Love survives when you don't ask for too much. And so they became skilled at surviving. What they hadn't learned, what no one had taught them, was that survival is not the same as connection. The danger wasn't that they didn't care. The danger was that they believed caring didn't require speaking. By the time marriage asked more of them than maintenance, silence was already part of who they were. And unlearning a lesson you never realized you were taught is one of the hardest things a relationship can face. The most powerful lessons are the ones no one remembers learning. By the time they stood beside each other exchanging vows, silence was not a flaw to either of them. It was a skill, a shared language they both spoke fluently, even if they had learned it in different ways. They believed they were choosing peace. In the early years, that belief was reinforced. When disagreements surfaced, they dissolved quickly. When misunderstandings appeared, they were smoothed over before they could harden into anything sharp. Friends envied how easy they seemed together. "Don't you two ever fight?" someone once asked. They smiled. "Nah, really." That answer felt like success. What no one explained, what no one ever explains, is that conflict isn't the enemy of love. Avoidance is, but avoidance wears many disguises. It looks like patience. It sounds like maturity. It feels like being considerate of another person's limits. And so, lesson by lesson, silence continued its quiet education. He learned that providing was enough. That consistency spoke louder than words. That emotional steadiness meant not rocking the boat. Each time he handled something without discussion, he felt useful, needed, reliable. Those feelings mattered to him more than he realized. She learned that harmony required restraint. That love was preserved by not demanding proof of it. Each time she swallowed a disappointment, and the house stayed calm, she felt accomplished, in control, strong. Those feelings mattered to her more than she admitted. Neither saw that they were being rewarded for disappearing just enough to make things easy. The educational cost of that reward came slowly. She stopped noticing her own disappointment right away. It arrived later, vague and dull, often at night when everything else had gone quiet. She told herself she was tired. She told herself everyone feels like this sometimes. He stopped noticing emotional absence at all. He interpreted quiet as contentment. After all, wasn't that what he had been taught to value? A calm house meant a good life. Neither questioned the system because it was working until it wasn't. There is a difference between peace and numbness, but it takes awareness to tell them apart. When she caught herself editing thoughts before they were fully formed, she didn't see it as loss. She saw it as discipline, maturity, growth. She believed she was becoming a better partner, When he caught himself steering conversations away from anything emotional, he didn't see avoidance. He saw efficiency, problem solving. He believed he was protecting their bond. Both were acting in good faith. That is what made the damage so difficult to detect. Education, when unexamined, becomes identity. Silence shaped how they measured love, not by closeness, but by lack of disruption, not by honesty, but by endurance, not by presence, but by stability. The danger of that model is not immediate. It doesn't break things overnight. It erodes slowly under the surface, where no one thinks to look. Over time, she began to forget which parts of herself were negotiable and which were essential. She told herself she didn't need much. She told herself wanting more was selfish. She told herself this was adulthood. Over time, he began to forget that emotions require attention, not assumption. He trusted the absence of complaint more than he trusted intuition. He believed silence was consent. Neither realized that silence, unlike agreement, does not renew itself. It simply accumulates. The marriage didn't lack care. It lacked curiosity. Neither asked the questions that might have changed the course early on. Questions like, what are we not saying? What do you need that you're not asking for? What feels heavy that we keep calling small? Those questions felt unnecessary, risky, potentially disruptive. And disruption was the one remembering they both worked hard to avoid. What they didn't understand yet was this: discomfort avoided does not disappear. It waits. It grows patient. It gathers strength in the quiet. By the time something finally demands to be spoken, it rarely arrives gently. But in those early years, nothing demanded anything. Everything seemed manageable. That was the illusion. They mistook compatibility for completeness. They believed shared restraint meant shared understanding. They assumed silence meant alignment. Education without reflection always leads somewhere unintended. They had been taught how not to fight. They had not been taught how to be known. They had learned how to survive relationships. They had not learned how to inhabit them fully. And so, without realizing it, they carried unfinished lessons into the center of their marriage. Lessons about worth, voice, and emotional risk that would one day require a reckoning. Not because love failed, but because silence had been allowed to teach them for too long, without ever being questioned. By the time they would begin to notice the cost, it would no longer feel small. And by then, silence would no longer feel safe. From the outside, their marriage looked like a quiet success. It had the shape people admired. Shared routines, predictable schedules, a calm that suggested maturity rather than distance. They arrived places together, left together, and rarely drew attention to themselves. Nothing about them felt chaotic or unresolved. People trusted their stability. Friends asked for advice, not because they seemed especially passionate, but because they seemed steady. They were the couple others pointed to. When conversations turned to what lasting love looked like. "You two make it look easy," someone once said. They smiled because it did. Ease became proof. They believed that love should fit smoothly into life, not disrupt it. That adulthood meant minimizing friction. That if something required too much explanation, it probably wasn't necessary. This belief shaped everything. Their home reflected it. Clean surfaces, neutral colors, nothing out of place. Even their disagreements, rare and understated, were resolved quickly, often before they were fully articulated. They were good at compromise, because they rarely pushed far enough to require it. If she wanted something and sensed hesitation, she adjusted. If he sensed tension, he redirected the conversation. Neither saw this as loss. They saw it as cooperation. Cooperation, they believed, was the foundation of partnership. Education teaches people what to value, and their lives reinforce the same lesson again and again. Calm was rewarded. At work, he was praised for being level-headed, for not taking things personally, for keeping things professional. Emotional restraint was considered competence. He brought that same approach home, believing it made him a better partner. At work, she was admired for being adaptable, for not making things difficult, for handling pressure quietly. Emotional flexibility was considered strength. She brought that same approach into her marriage, believing it made her easier to love. Neither questioned the overlap between professional survival and personal intimacy. They assumed success in one translated naturally into success in the other. The truth was more complicated. Their conversations stayed efficient. Updates replaced check-ins. Decisions were made quickly, with minimal discussion. They trusted each other's judgment, which reduced the need to explain or explore feelings. Trust, in this form, felt clean. But trust without curiosity becomes assumption. When something felt off, both responded the same way. They minimized it. He told himself it was temporary. She told herself it wasn't important enough to mention. Over time, those small dismissals added up to a quiet emotional backlog neither of them tracked. The absence of conflict became a source of pride. They compared themselves to other couples, the loud ones, the volatile ones, the ones who fought openly and often. They told themselves they were doing something right by avoiding that chaos. They didn't see that conflict avoided does not disappear. It simply changes shape. There is a difference between choosing peace and choosing silence, but the distinction requires attention. Attention requires willingness. Willingness requires risk. They avoided all three. When people asked how long they'd been married, the answer came with a smile. When people asked how they made it work, the answer was vague. We respect each other. We don't sweat the small stuff. Those answers were true. They just weren't complete. Small things are only small when they're addressed. Left unattended, they become patterns. Patterns become expectations. Expectations shape emotional reality. The educational mistake they made was not in what they believed, but in what they assumed would take care of itself. They believed love was durable. They believed silence was harmless. They believed good intentions protected relationships from erosion. Those beliefs were comforting. They were also incomplete. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. That was the problem, because when everything looks fine, no one thinks to look closer. Not friends, not family, not even the people living inside the marriage. What they didn't yet understand was that relationships don't fail because they lack love. They fail because they lack attention to the places where love is quietly withdrawing. And withdrawal, when unspoken, is easy to miss, especially when life appears to be working exactly as planned. What looked like balance from the outside slowly became imbalance on the inside. They had built a life that ran smoothly because both of them were careful not to ask too much of it. Needs were weighed before being expressed. Feelings were filtered for usefulness. If something couldn't be resolved quickly, it was postponed indefinitely. Postponement became routine. She learned how to talk around things instead of through them. If she felt disconnected, she mentioned being tired. If she felt lonely, she blamed the season, the workload, the pace of life. She translated emotional needs into practical language because practical language felt safer. He learned how to listen without hearing. He responded to what was said, not what was missing. If she mentioned stress, he offered solutions. If she mentioned exhaustion, he suggested rest. He was attentive, just not in the way intimacy requires. Neither noticed how often conversations ended without resolution. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, no slammed doors. That absence felt like proof that they were doing something right. But something else was absent too. Curiosity. They stopped wondering about each other in the way people do when they feel allowed to change. They assumed continuity where there was actually quiet drift. They trusted history more than present experience. Education teaches through reinforcement, and life reinforced their habits daily. When she didn't speak up, nothing bad happened. When he didn't ask questions, things stayed calm. Silence was rewarded. They chose it again. Over time, she stopped expecting to be asked how she was really doing. When someone doesn't ask for long enough, expectation adjusts. She told herself that being understood without explanation was unrealistic. Anyway, over time, he stopped noticing emotional cues. When nothing was said, he assumed nothing was wrong. He trusted words more than patterns, because patterns required interpretation, and interpretation invited uncertainty. They both valued certainty. That shared value kept them aligned, but it also kept them shallow. The marriage did not feel unhappy. It felt incomplete, in a way that was difficult to name, like a room that had been carefully arranged, but never fully lived in. They laughed together. They functioned well. They rarely disappointed each other in visible ways. Yet something essential was missing, something neither of them could point to without breaking the calm they had worked so hard to maintain. Education without reflection has consequences. She began to feel invisible in moments that should have felt intimate. Sitting next to him on the couch, she felt space where closeness used to live. She wondered if this was what long-term love naturally became. He began to feel unnecessary in moments that should have felt connective. He showed up, handled responsibilities, did what was expected, and still felt a quiet distance he couldn't fix with effort. Both assumed this was normal. After all, no one had told them otherwise. The problem with normalizing quiet dissatisfaction is that it lowers expectations. Once expectations lower, effort follows. Once effort declines, intimacy fades, not because anyone stopped caring, but because caring was never translated into presence. They were still choosing each other every day. They just weren't choosing to know each other anymore. And knowledge, unlike affection, does not maintain itself. It requires attention. It requires questions. It requires the willingness to hear answers that might complicate the story you've told yourself about how well things are going. They weren't ready for that. Not yet, because as long as the marriage looked good, it felt unnecessary to examine what it cost to keep it that way. They didn't understand that appearances can be sustained long after connection has begun to erode. By the time they would notice what was missing, silence would no longer feel like peace, would feel like distance. And distance, once normalized, is much harder to close than conflict ever is. What changed after that conversation wasn't obvious. That was what made it effective. Didn't become cold. She didn't grow distant in ways anyone could point to. She simply recalibrated. Subtly, internally, the way people do when they realize something about themselves they don't yet know how to say out loud. She began measuring her wants before expressing them. Not in a dramatic way, in practical one. This necessary? Is this worth explaining? Will this create a conversation that leads nowhere? Often, the answer came back the same. It's easier not to. So she adjusted expectations quietly. She told herself that adulthood meant compromise, that long marriages were built on flexibility, not insistence, that love wasn't about getting everything you wanted. It was about choosing what to let go of. Those thoughts felt reasonable, mature, even generous. But generosity that is never reciprocated with curiosity slowly turns into erasure. He noticed none of this because there was nothing loud to notice. From his perspective, life remained steady. If anything, it felt easier. There were fewer discussions, fewer decisions that required emotional navigation. Everything seemed to flow. He believed this meant they were in sync. That belief wasn't born of neglect. It born of trust. He trusted that she would speak if something mattered. He trusted that silence meant agreement. He trusted the absence of conflict more than he trusted the possibility of unspoken dissatisfaction. Trust, when misplaced, can be just as damaging as doubt. When she stopped bringing up small preferences, where to eat, who to visit, how to spend free time, he interpreted it as flexibility. He appreciated how easy she was to be with. He admired her adaptability. He didn't realize that adaptability has limits. Every time she said, "Whatever you want," a small piece of her decision-making stepped back. Every time she smiled through something that disappointed her, she taught herself that her feelings were optional. Education happens through repetition. The marriage began to lean, not sharply, not dangerously, but noticeably enough that she felt it. He did not. When she felt tired, she no longer expected comfort. When she felt lonely, she no longer reached for connection. She managed herself quietly, the way she had learned to do long before she ever met him. He, meanwhile, believed he was being a good partner. He showed up. He handled responsibilities. He remained consistent. From his perspective, consistency was care. What he didn't see was that care without presence eventually feels transactional. The distance that followed wasn't intentional. It was cumulative. She spent more time at work, not because she loved it more, but because it required less emotional translation. There were expectations there, clear ones. Speak when necessary. Perform well. Go home. He noticed the longer hours, but framed them logically. Career demands, financial planning, temporary stress. Everything had an explanation that didn't require deeper inquiry. Inquiry felt unnecessary when answers seemed obvious. This was how silence protected itself, by offering reasonable alternatives to curiosity. When they did talk, conversations stayed on safe ground. Logistics, schedules, news, neutral observations. Nothing that risked uncovering the quiet adjustments she had been making. Nothing that forced him to notice the absence of emotional bids he no longer received. Neither of them was lying. That was the most dangerous part. She told the truth when she said she was fine. She had learned to make it true by narrowing her expectations. He told the truth when he believed things were okay. Nothing visibly contradicted that belief, but relationships are not measured only by what is visible. They are measured by what is no longer attempted. By the time she realized she no longer expected him to ask certain questions, it frightened her, not because she blamed him, but because she recognized how much of herself she had already stopped offering. By the time he realized conversations felt thinner, he dismissed the thought. He told himself this was what long-term partnership looked like. Comfortable, predictable, quiet. Neither wanted to disrupt the stability they had built. But stability that depends on silence is fragile, even when it looks strong. The fracture that began with "we'll see" had never been repaired, not because it caused harm on its own, but because it taught both of them a lesson they never revisited. She learned that her wants were negotiable. He learned that silence meant alignment. Those lessons settled into the foundation of the marriage, shaping every interaction that followed. And foundations, once set, determine how much weight a structure can carry long before any visible cracks appear. Responsibility became the language they spoke most fluently. When his parent fell ill, there was no discussion about what needed to be done. She adjusted her schedule without being asked, took call, managed appointments, filled the gaps quietly, efficiently, without complaint. He noticed. He appreciated it. He thanked her, but he didn't ask how it felt. She didn't offer. This was how love moved between them now, through action, not acknowledgement, through reliability, not reflection. Crisis has a way of clarifying roles. In their marriage, it confirmed what had already been forming. He handled logistics. She absorbed emotion. He focused on solutions. She managed the weight those solutions carried. Both believed they were doing the right thing. When her job became uncertain months later, the pattern repeated in reverse. He picked up extra hours without mentioning the strain, reworked budgets late at night, ensured stability without asking for reassurance. She noticed. She appreciated it. She thanked him, but she didn't ask how it felt. He didn't offer. They had become very good at protecting each other from discomfort, so good that they no longer shared it. On the surface, this looked like partnership at its best. Mutual sacrifice, shared responsibility, dependability under pressure. Friends praised them. You two really show up for each other. They smiled because it was true, but something important was missing. Responsibility can hold a life together, but it cannot make a person feel known. Over time, care became procedural. Acts of love were completed efficiently, like items checked off a list. Each task accomplished reinforced the belief that everything was fine. No one fell apart. No one demanded more. And yet, something quietly hardened. She began to feel that her emotional labor was invisible, not because he ignored her, but because it had become expected. She didn't resent him for it. She simply adjusted again, telling herself that this was what being strong looked like. He began to feel that his role was defined by usefulness. As long as he was providing, fixing, handling things, he believed he was doing his part. He didn't realize that usefulness, while valuable, is not the same as intimacy. Neither questioned the imbalance, because it wasn't obvious enough to confront. Education often comes disguised as necessity. They learned that showing up meant doing, not sharing. That support meant action, not presence. That emotional exposure was optional as long as life remained functional. The marriage continued to move forward on these assumptions. Evenings became quieter, not awkward, just subdued. They sat together, but parallel, shared space without sharing much else. Comfort replaced closeness, and neither knew when the transition happened. She sometimes wanted to talk, not about problems exactly, but about how the weight of holding everything together felt. She wanted to say she was tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix, but she didn't know how to begin. He sometimes sensed something unspoken, an absence he couldn't define. He considered asking, but worried it would open something he didn't know how to carry. So he stayed practical, helpful, solid. They were both acting out of care, but care, when stripped of curiosity, slowly becomes distance. The marriage wasn't failing. It was enduring. And endurance, when mistaken for intimacy, can quietly convince people that survival is the highest form of love, until one day it no longer feels like enough. Endurance became their shared pride. They told themselves that weathering difficulty together was proof of depth, that staying functional under pressure meant they were doing something right. Neither of them realized how much they had come to equate love with tolerance. She handled emotional strain the way she handled everything else, internally. When she felt overwhelmed, she organized. When she felt unseen, she became more efficient. When she felt lonely, she told herself it was temporary. Temporary became permanent without announcement. He handled strain by narrowing focus. If something couldn't be fixed, it was set aside. He believed unresolved emotions created unnecessary instability. Better to stay useful. Better to stay steady. Both believed they were protecting the marriage. What they were actually doing was protecting it from honesty. There were moments, small ones, when the truth almost surfaced, like the night she sat at the edge of the bed after a long day, shoes still on, staring at nothing. He noticed the stillness and asked if she was tired. She said yes. He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and turned off the light. What she had wanted to say was that she felt worn down in a way rest wouldn't fix, that she missed being asked questions without having to earn them, that she felt strong everywhere except where she wanted to feel soft. But tired was easier. Or the morning he stood in the doorway watching her rush out, already thinking about the list of things he needed to accomplish that day. He felt something then, a flicker of distance, but dismissed it. Everyone gets busy. Everyone goes through phases. Phases eventually become patterns. Responsibility filled the space where intimacy once lived. And responsibility, while admirable, does not ask how something feels. It asks only whether it gets done. They became very good at getting things done. The problem was not that they stopped loving each other. It was that love became something they assumed rather than something they expressed. Education without correction compounds. Each unspoken moment taught them that the marriage would continue without emotional exchange. Each successful crisis reinforced the belief that feelings were secondary. Each day that passed without confrontation convinced them they were avoiding damage. They did not see the damage accumulating quietly. She began to feel like the emotional center of the relationship without ever agreeing to the role. She carried awareness, anticipation, adjustment. He carried provision, planning, stability. Both loads were heavy. Neither was shared. He began to feel necessary, but not essential. Useful, but not needed in the way connection requires. He didn't recognize the feeling at first. It manifested as restlessness, as distraction, as a vague sense that something was missing without knowing what. Neither of them knew how to name the imbalance, because it didn't look like imbalance. There were no raised voices, no unmet obligations, no visible failures. Everything worked. That was the illusion. The educational cost of endurance is that it teaches people to survive conditions they should question. She questioned herself instead. Maybe this is just adulthood. Maybe wanting more is unrealistic. Maybe this is what commitment looks like once the excitement fades. He questioned circumstances instead. Maybe work is stressful. Maybe this season is demanding. Maybe things will naturally shift back. Both were waiting for a change that required action. Neither of them was taking. Silence doesn't create urgency. It creates delay. The marriage continued forward on momentum alone, not collapsing, not improving, just moving, like a structure held upright by habit rather than intention. They didn't understand yet that responsibility, when it replaces emotional exchange, eventually exhausts the very people it's meant to support. And exhaustion, when unspoken, does not disappear. It turns inward. These stories aren't about perfect love. They're about real choices and real consequences. If you value storytelling that teaches life lessons through honesty and depth, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for the next chapter. Distance did not arrive as neglect. It arrived as practicality. It began with small adjustments that made sense on the surface. Later evenings, earlier mornings, less lingering in doorways, fewer conversations that wandered without purpose. Each change solved a problem. None of them felt like a loss at the time. She stayed later at work more often, telling herself it was temporary. There were projects to finish, deadlines to meet, expectations to manage. Work had clear rules, clear outcomes. Effort led to recognition. At home, effort disappeared quietly. He noticed the longer hours and told himself it was ambition, responsibility, a season that required patience. He respected her work ethic. He admired how she handled pressure without complaint. He did not ask what she was avoiding. She did not say when she came home late. The house was already settled. Lights dimmed, dishes done. He greeted her kindly, without expectation. She appreciated that. It felt considerate. It also felt empty in a way she couldn't articulate. They updated each other efficiently. Long day. Same here. We'll talk tomorrow. Tomorrow became a placeholder that never quite arrived. Distance thrives on reason. Every missed conversation had an explanation. Every moment of emotional absence could be traced to something practical. Fatigue, schedules, stress, none of it felt personal. That was what made it dangerous. She told herself she was protecting the marriage by not bringing heavy feelings home. He told himself he was respecting her space by not pressing for more conversation. Both believed they were being thoughtful. Education happens through justification as much as repetition. They justified the growing quiet as adulthood, as normal, as something every long-term relationship goes through once life becomes demanding. Neither questioned whether the demands were external or self-imposed. She began to notice that home no longer felt like a place of emotional rest. It was peaceful, yes, orderly, predictable, but it did not replenish her. It asked nothing of her, and that absence made her feel strangely unnecessary. He began to notice that conversations felt thinner, shorter, more transactional. He missed something, though he couldn't say what. He assumed it was nostalgia, longing for an earlier phase that inevitably fades. He didn't consider that intimacy doesn't fade on its own. It recedes when it is no longer invited. Even when they were together, presence felt divided. One eye on a screen, one thought on tomorrow. Shared space without shared attention. Neither confronted it because confrontation felt excessive. There was no crisis to justify it, no clear problem to solve. Distance, when framed as efficiency, rarely raises alarms. She started planning her days without factoring him in emotionally, not out of resentment, but out of habit. It was easier to manage expectations alone, easier to rely on herself. He started planning his days, assuming independence. He didn't check in the way he once had, not because he didn't care, but because care had become synonymous with not intruding. They were both trying not to be a burden. The irony was that in trying to make life easier for each other, they were making themselves harder to reach. Education without awareness leads people to repeat patterns, even when those patterns stop serving them. Neither of them noticed when distance stopped being a temporary adjustment and became the new normal. There was no announcement, no turning point, just a quiet acceptance that this was how things were now. Distance felt practical, and anything practical feels difficult to challenge, especially when it's working. For a while, it was. But distance, no matter how logical, always asks a question eventually: who are we becoming while we avoid each other so efficiently? Neither of them was ready to answer that. Yet, practical distance has a way of reshaping expectations before anyone realizes it. What once felt temporary began to feel permanent, not because they chose it deliberately, but because nothing interrupted it. No argument forced a conversation. No crisis demanded emotional presence. Life continued to function, and function became justification. She stopped expecting check-ins. If he didn't ask how her day had really been, she filled the silence herself. If he didn't notice the fatigue behind her voice, she corrected it. She learned to arrive home already adjusted, already composed. He stopped expecting connection to require effort. If she didn't initiate conversation, he assumed she needed space. He told himself he was being respectful. He didn't see how often that respect doubled as retreat. Neither of them recognized how their definitions of care had shifted. Care became non-interference. Support became distance. Love became maintenance. They still shared moments, small, pleasant ones. A meal eaten together, brief laugh, a familiar routine that felt comforting because it required no risk. Those moments reassured them that nothing was truly wrong. But reassurance without depth has limits. She began to feel like an observer in her own marriage, present but not engaged, needed but not sought, valued but not pursued. He began to feel replaceable in ways he couldn't explain, not because she treated him poorly, but because his presence didn't seem to change anything. He showed up, and life continued the same whether he leaned in emotionally or stayed back. That realization unsettled him. Still, he didn't speak, because silence had taught him that speaking, when nothing was visibly broken, was unnecessary. Education works best when questioned. When it isn't, it becomes invisible. Distance also changed how they interpreted each other's behavior. She began to read neutrality as indifference. He began to read quiet as contentment. Both interpretations were wrong, but neither was challenged. They were no longer reacting to each other. They were reacting to assumptions. At night, lying beside him, she sometimes wondered if he noticed how much she had changed. She wondered if he remembered the version of her who used to reach more easily, who used to speak without rehearsing. He sometimes wondered when conversations had started feeling like obligations rather than invitations. He wondered if this was simply what time did to people. Neither wondered aloud. The educational value of this stage of their marriage was cruel in its subtlety. It taught them that distance could exist without malice, without drama, without anyone being clearly at fault. That made it harder to address, because when no one is wrong, it feels unnecessary to ask whether something is missing. Distance also taught them how quickly emotional habits harden. What begins as a coping mechanism becomes a norm. What feels like accommodation becomes expectation. She accommodated by staying quiet. He accommodated by staying practical. Together, they created a space where emotional honesty had nowhere to land. Still, they told themselves they were fine. That word carried them through many days. Fine enough, functional enough, good enough, but fine is not fulfillment. Fulfillment requires risk. Risk requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires the willingness to disturb the peace you've built. They weren't ready for that. Not yet. Distance continued to settle into the marriage like furniture that never moved. Once arranged, it became part of the room, easy to navigate around, difficult to imagine living without. By the time either of them would consider rearranging it, they would have to admit how long it had been there, and that admission would require something silence had taught them to avoid at all costs: an honest conversation. The question came on an ordinary night. Nothing had gone wrong that day. No argument, no disappointment large enough to justify what followed. Dinner had been eaten without complaint. The television murmured in the background. The house looked exactly the way it always did. Calm, orderly, undisturbed. That was why the question surprised her. She hadn't planned to ask it. It surfaced the way truths often do, when there's finally enough quiet for them to be heard. They were sitting side by side, close enough that their arms almost touched. Almost had become common. Do you ever feel like we don't talk anymore? She asked. Her voice was careful, not accusing, not emotional. She framed it as curiosity, the way she framed most things now. She did not want to sound dissatisfied. She did not want to open something she couldn't close. She just wanted to know if he noticed. The question landed heavier than she intended. He felt it immediately, not as anger, but as pressure, a tightening in his chest, a sense that something fragile had been placed in his hands without instruction. He replayed the past weeks in his mind, the shared meals, the quiet evenings, the absence of conflict. Everything seemed intact. We're fine, he said after a moment. Every couple goes through phases. He meant it as reassurance, a reminder not to overthink something that didn't need analysis. He believed he was offering stability. She heard something else. She heard dismissal, not intentional, not cruel, but final. The word fine closed the space the question had opened. It told her that what she was noticing didn't require further attention, that whatever she was feeling belonged to her alone. She nodded. She always nodded. That nod carried years of adjustment in it, years of choosing quiet over clarity, years of trusting that if something mattered enough, it would be addressed without her having to insist. This time, something shifted. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was conclusive. She didn't bring it up again, not because she felt unheard, but because she felt finished trying. The question had been her last experiment, her final attempt to see if the distance she felt existed in both of them. Now she knew. He watched her nod and felt relieved. The tension he had sensed dissipated quickly. Crisis avoided. Calm restored. He leaned back into the familiar comfort of routine. He did not realize that the question had not been resolved. It had been retired. Education often arrives too late to prevent damage, but early enough to explain it. She learned that even carefully worded honesty had limits here, that naming absence did not invite presence, that her instincts were correct, but unwelcomed. He learned nothing because nothing appeared to require learning. That imbalance mattered. From that night forward, she stopped reaching. Not dramatically, not bitterly. She simply redirected her energy inward. She no longer searched for openings in conversation. She no longer waited for moments that might invite closeness. She accepted what was. He noticed the quiet deepen, but welcomed it. It felt like resolution, like proof that everything was okay after all. Neither understood that something essential had just been decided. The marriage did not end that night, but the effort did. And effort, once withdrawn, is rarely noticed right away, especially when silence has already taught both people how to live without it. The days that followed looked no different from the ones before. That was the danger. Mornings still began on time. Evenings still settled into quiet routines. Words were exchanged when necessary. Politeness never slipped, and nothing in their home suggested rupture. If anything, things felt smoother. Less tension, fewer pauses, fewer moments that asked for interpretation. He took this as confirmation. Whatever discomfort had surfaced that night, he believed it had passed. He told himself the reassurance had worked. That naming a phase had placed the feeling where it belonged. Temporary, harmless, unworthy of further attention. He didn't know that something had ended. She moved through the days differently now. Not colder, not distant, in ways that could be criticized. She simply withdrew expectation. The shift was internal, subtle enough that even she didn't immediately recognize its weight. She stopped waiting for emotional engagement, stopped preparing thoughts she hoped to share later, stopped saving observations for conversations that might never happen. It felt strangely calming. When you stop hoping, you stop being disappointed. That calm, however, came at a cost. She began to treat the marriage as a stable environment rather than a living connection, something dependable, predictable, and emotionally contained. A place where nothing would surprise her, especially not intimacy. He noticed that she no longer initiated conversation, but he assumed she was tired, or content, or simply comfortable in the quiet they shared. He had learned long ago not to read too much into silence. Silence, after all, had never demanded anything from him. Education works most efficiently when it confirms what we already believe. She learned that clarity did not live here, that asking direct questions led to gentle dismissal rather than engagement. She learned that protecting herself meant lowering her emotional reach. He learned, without realizing it, that reassurance could replace inquiry, that naming something normal was enough to make it disappear. Neither lesson prepared them for what came next. The space between them grew, but it grew evenly, balanced. There was no obvious gap to bridge, because neither leaned in anymore. They shared logistics instead of thoughts, updates instead of stories, decisions instead of dreams. The language of partnership remained intact, but the language of intimacy quietly vanished. At night, lying beside him, she felt a new kind of loneliness. Not sharp, not dramatic, but settled. The kind that arrives after effort has been exhausted, and options have narrowed. She didn't feel angry. That scared her. Anger would have meant hope, Anger would have meant something still wanted change. What she felt instead was acceptance. He felt something, too, though he couldn't name it. A sense of emotional stillness that felt heavier than calm. He assumed it was simply the weight of time, the natural settling of a long relationship. He did not realize that relationships do not settle. They either deepen or thin, and thinning rarely makes noise. The educational truth of this moment was harsh, but simple. When vulnerability is met with reassurance instead of curiosity, people learn to stop offering it. She had offered carefully. He had responded efficiently. Neither was wrong, but rightness does not preserve connection. From that night forward, silence was no longer a shared habit, became a boundary, and boundaries, once formed, shape everything that follows. The separation did not begin with an argument. It began with relief. She noticed it one morning as she moved through the house without anticipating him. No quiet listening for his steps. No mental note of something she might mention later. Her day unfolded cleanly, uninterrupted by expectation. The absence felt lighter. That frightened her more than sadness would have. For a long time, she had believed that distance hurt because it meant something was wrong. Now she understood something else. Distance also hurts because it means something has already been let go. She didn't announce her withdrawal. There was nothing to announce. She simply stopped reaching for something that had stopped responding. He felt the shift, but not clearly. It registered as ease. Fewer moments of uncertainty. Less emotional navigation. Their interactions became smoother, almost professional in their efficiency. He mistook this for progress. They coordinated schedules with precision, communicated clearly about logistics, shared meals without tension. From the outside, they looked more stable than ever. Inside, something was loosening. She began spending more time alone, not out of loneliness, but out of self-preservation. Solitude required no translation, no adjustment, no careful phrasing. It allowed her to exist without managing how she was perceived. She realized how tired she had been. He began to feel strangely unnecessary, not unappreciated. She still thanked him, still acknowledged his efforts, but unnecessary in the way emotional presence makes a difference. He showed up the same way he always had. Fixed things, planned ahead, took care of responsibilities. But his presence no longer changed the emotional temperature of the room. That unsettled him. Still, he did not speak. Silence had taught him that naming discomfort created instability. He believed stability was something to protect at all costs. Education becomes dangerous when it teaches people to preserve structure instead of meaning. She began to imagine what space might look like, not as abandonment, but as honesty, not as punishment, but as clarity. The idea surfaced quietly, without urgency. She didn't want to leave in anger. She didn't want to argue. She wanted room to feel again. He sensed her growing inward focus, but interpreted it as independence. Strength! He admired it. He didn't realize independence had become isolation. When she finally said she needed space, it wasn't dramatic. "I think I need some time," she said one evening, voice steady. "Just to think." The words landed hard. He felt blindsided, not because the signs weren't there, but because he had trained himself not to read them. He replayed their recent days in his mind. The calm, the cooperation, the absence of conflict. Everything had looked fine. He asked practical questions. How long? Where? Logistics. He stayed calm, because calm was what he knew how to offer. She answered gently. What she did not say was that the space had already begun inside her long before she asked for it in real life. The separation was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic scenes. Just two people standing in the aftermath of years of reasonable choices, finally facing the consequence of what had never been said. Silence had done its work, patiently, and now it had created distance that could no longer be managed from inside the same room. Space changes things even before it fully begins. The first nights apart were not dramatic. There were no tearful calls, no frantic messages asking for reassurance. The quiet they had practiced for years followed them easily into separate rooms, separate routines, separate days. That familiarity was unsettling. She noticed how quickly her body adjusted, how easily she slept without listening for his breathing, how naturally her evenings stretched without accounting for anyone else's rhythms. The realization felt both freeing and devastating. Freedom, she understood now, does not always arrive with joy. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. He noticed the absence differently. The house felt larger, but not emptier in the way he expected. He had assumed he would feel immediate loss, sharp and undeniable. Instead, what he felt was confusion. How could something so calm feel so final? He moved through his days performing the same tasks, keeping the same routines, but without the quiet validation of sharing space. The usefulness he had relied on no longer had an audience. There was no one to fix things for, no one whose stability depended on his steadiness. For the first time, he felt unnecessary in a way effort could not resolve. That frightened him. Education often arrives in moments of absence, when the structure you depended on remains, but the meaning disappears. She began to reflect on the years behind her, not with anger, but with a strange compassion. She saw how often she had chosen quiet over clarity, peace over presence. She saw how capable she had become at surviving without being seen. She asked herself hard questions she had once avoided. When had she learned that asking for emotional attention was too much? When had she decided that love should not require explanation? When had she stopped believing she deserved to be known? The answers were not simple, but they were honest. He began asking questions too, though later than he wished he had. He replayed moments he had dismissed. The nod after the question, the growing quiet he had welcomed, the distance he had mistaken for contentment. He realized how often he had chosen reassurance over curiosity, not because he didn't care, but because curiosity required him to sit with uncertainty. Uncertainty had always felt unsafe. Silence had been his armor. Without it, he felt exposed. They met weeks later in a neutral place, not to reconcile, not to decide anything, but to acknowledge what was happening. The conversation was careful, respectful, restrained. That restraint was familiar. But something had changed. They spoke honestly, not expansively, but deliberately. She named the exhaustion of carrying herself alone. He named the fear of opening conversations he didn't know how to hold. There were no accusations, no rewriting of the past, just recognition. Recognition that love had existed. Recognition that effort had existed. Recognition that silence had slowly replaced connection. They did not promise to fix anything. Education at this stage wasn't about solutions. It was about awareness. They learned that dignity does not come from endurance alone. They learned that peace without presence is not peace. It is avoidance. They learned that silence, once relied upon, demands a cost. Whether they would rebuild or walk away was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, uncertainty felt more honest than quiet certainty ever had. Silence no longer protected them. And in that exposure, something fragile but real finally had room to exist. Absence did what presence never had. It removed the noise of routine and left only what was true. Without the daily choreography of marriage, the shared schedules, the quiet cooperation, the unspoken agreements, she could finally hear herself think. There was no one to accommodate, no emotional tone to manage, no peace to preserve at her own expense. What surfaced surprised her. She had expected grief, anger, regret. Instead, what she felt first was exhaustion. Not the kind sleep fixes, the kind that comes from years of self-editing, from carrying feelings quietly, from shrinking herself just enough to make everything run smoothly. She realized how often she had mistaken strength for silence. She had believed that being low maintenance made her lovable, that asking less meant being easier to keep, that enduring quietly was a form of maturity. No one had forced those beliefs on her. She had chosen them, one reasonable decision at a time. That realization hurt, but it also gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time: agency. She began to understand that silence had not only protected the marriage, it had protected her from confronting what she wanted and feared. Speaking up meant risking disappointment. Silence had offered control. Control, she now saw, had come at the cost of intimacy. Across town, absence was teaching him something different, but just as necessary. Without her steady presence, his sense of usefulness felt exposed. The routines he relied on still existed, but they felt hollow. There was no one to notice the effort, no one to benefit quietly from his reliability. For the first time, he had to sit with emotions he couldn't fix. He noticed how quickly his mind searched for solutions, ways to repair, improve, stabilize. When none appeared, he felt restless, vulnerable, unsteady. He realized how deeply he had relied on silence to maintain control. Silence had allowed him to avoid conversations he feared mishandling. It had allowed him to believe that providing stability was enough. It had allowed him to remain competent without being exposed. Now, without it, he felt unsure of who he was in a relationship. He began replaying moments with new clarity. The unsent messages, the questions he hadn't asked, the reassurance he had offered instead of curiosity. He saw how often he had chosen certainty over connection, not because he didn't care, but because caring without a clear role frightened him. Education arrived slowly, but it arrived honestly. He learned that being dependable is not the same as being emotionally available, that fixing problems is not the same as sitting with discomfort, that silence can be a refuge, but also a hiding place. She learned that endurance is not dignity when it requires erasure. That strength includes voice. That peace without presence is simply quiet loneliness. Neither lesson was easy. Both were earned. They were no longer examining the marriage to decide who was right or wrong. They were examining themselves, how they had been shaped, what they had protected, and what they had avoided. For the first time, growth was not tied to saving the relationship. It was tied to self-respect, and that, more than reconciliation or separation, would determine what came next. With distance came a different kind of honesty, one that didn't require agreement or reassurance to survive. She began noticing how her body responded to everyday choices, now that she was no longer negotiating them silently. What wanted to eat, how she wanted to spend her evenings, when she wanted company, and when she didn't. The simplicity of those decisions felt almost unfamiliar. She realized how often she had deferred without recognizing it as loss. In the marriage, deferral had felt polite. Now, it felt like absence. She started practicing something that once felt dangerous, naming her needs without softening them. Not to demand anything, just to hear herself speak clearly. The more she did it, the less frightening it became. She wasn't becoming louder. She was becoming present. He was practicing something too, though it felt clumsier. Sitting with questions that didn't have immediate answers. Letting discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it. Noticing how quickly he wanted to explain things away. He realized how often he had equated emotional engagement with potential failure. If he didn't know what to say, he stayed quiet. If he couldn't guarantee a good outcome, he avoided the conversation. Silence, he now saw, had protected his image as someone steady and capable. But it had also kept him distant. He began paying attention to his own inner responses instead of managing situations around him. The unease, the defensiveness, the urge to reassure instead of listen. Each reaction taught him something about the habits he had carried for years without questioning. Education, at this stage, was uncomfortable. It asked him to admit that calm had sometimes been a strategy, not a virtue. That being fine had been easier than being present. That peace, when preserved at all costs, eventually cost something important. They spoke again, later, with more space between their reflections and fewer expectations of outcome. The conversation was different this time, not because it was emotional, but because it was honest. She spoke without cushioning her words. He listened without preparing solutions. Neither interrupted, neither defended. They acknowledged what had happened without rewriting history. She did not accuse him of neglect. He did not accuse her of withdrawal. They recognized that both had participated in the silence, even if they had arrived there for different reasons. They talked about boundaries, not as ultimatums, but as clarity. What they could offer now, what they could not continue pretending, was enough. For the first time, the conversation did not aim to restore comfort. It aimed to restore dignity. They understood something then that they hadn't before. Love does not require endurance at the expense of self. And connection cannot be rebuilt on the same silence that dismantled it. Whether they would rebuild together or continue apart was still unknown. But whatever came next would be shaped by choice, not habit. They had learned that small decisions matter, not because they are dramatic, but because they accumulate. Because what you repeatedly choose becomes what you live. Silence had once felt safe. Now it felt like a lesson learned. And lessons learned, when truly understood, do not repeat themselves. Whatever future waited beyond this point would not be quiet by default. It would be honest, or it would not exist at all. They did not rush the ending. For the first time in a long while, neither of them felt pressured to decide what the relationship should become. The urgency that once lived beneath every quiet compromise had dissolved. What remained was something steadier, heavier, and more honest. Choice. They met again, not out of habit, not out of obligation, but because both understood that clarity deserved a final conversation, one that wasn't about repair or blame, but about truth. They chose a place that asked nothing of them. Neutral, ordinary, somewhere no one would expect reconciliation or conflict. Just two people sitting across from each other without a script. Silence filled the space between them at first, but it was different now. It wasn't avoidance. It wasn't retreat. It was consideration. He spoke first, slowly, as if measuring each word against what he had learned. I didn't know how to stay when I didn't know how to speak, he said. I thought being calm was enough. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a confession. meant to absolve him. It was an observation, one he had finally allowed himself to make. She listened without interruption, without nodding to soften the moment, without translating his words into something easier to accept. "I thought asking for more would make me harder to love," she said when it was her turn. "So I stopped asking." They let those truths sit where they belonged, between them, not aimed like weapons, not offered as apologies, but acknowledged as facts. This was the education silence had delayed for years. They spoke about boundaries now. Not rules, not demands, just honest limits. What he could offer, moving forward, what she could no longer accept. They understood something fundamental. Love that requires self-erasure is not sustainable, no matter how peaceful it appears. And love that avoids emotional risk eventually avoids intimacy altogether. Neither wanted that again. They did not promise to fix the past. They did not pretend insight alone could undo years of habit. They respected the weight of what had been lost without dramatizing it. Dignity mattered more than reassurance now. They acknowledged that rebuilding would require consistent presence, not intention. That honesty would need to be practiced, not declared. That silence, once comfortable, would have to be questioned every time it appeared. And they acknowledged something else, too. Something quieter, but just as important, that walking away with respect could also be a form of love. Not the love of endurance, not the love of sacrifice, but the love of truth. They sat with that understanding, neither rushing to claim victory or defeat. The outcome mattered less than the clarity they had reached to get there. Silence no longer decided for them. Whatever came next would be chosen deliberately, spoken into existence, not assumed. For the first time since the beginning, the future did not feel peaceful. It felt honest, and honesty, unlike silence, asked them to stand fully present in their lives, together or apart, with nothing hidden and nothing left unsaid. They left the conversation without dramatic closure. No promises were made that couldn't be kept. No declarations were offered to soften the weight of reality. What they carried with them instead was something quieter and more durable: respect for themselves and for each other. They understood now that endings do not always come with finality. Sometimes they arrive with clarity. In the days that followed, they moved forward differently. Not hurried, not stalled, just intentional. She noticed how her choices felt heavier and lighter at the same time. He noticed how speaking, even imperfectly, felt less frightening than withholding himself entirely. Both felt the strain of new habits forming, but also the relief of not living on autopilot. They did not rush back into each other's lives, and they did not rush away. They allowed space to exist, honestly. What mattered most was no longer whether the marriage survived in its original form. What mattered was that neither of them would survive by disappearing again. Silence had once shaped their relationship without consent. It had taught them how to endure, how to adapt, how to remain functional at the cost of being fully known. Now, silence no longer held authority. If they rebuilt, it would be with intention. Conversations held even when uncomfortable, presence offered even when uncertain, and needs named before they hardened into distance. If they parted, it would be without bitterness, acknowledging that love had been real, effort had been real, and the lessons learned were real. Either path required courage. And courage, they finally understood, was not loud. It was the quiet decision to speak when staying silent felt easier. The marriage had looked perfect once, stable, calm, disturbed. But perfection, built on silence, had nearly erased them both. What remained now was something far more valuable than appearance: awareness. They had learned that love does not fade because people stop caring. It fades when people stop showing up where it matters. They had learned that small choices, unsent messages, unasked questions, unspoken needs, quietly shape lives. And they had learned that dignity is not found in endurance alone, but in honesty paired with self-respect. Whether they walked forward together or apart, one thing was certain: silence would no longer be mistaken for love. And that lesson, earned slowly, painfully, and truthfully, would shape every choice they made from that moment on. This wasn't a story about betrayal or drama. It was about how small, reasonable choices quietly shape our lives. If this story taught you something meaningful about love, communication, or self-respect, like this video so others can learn from it too. Subscribe for more meaningful love stories like this.